Hello, everyone, and welcome to another virtual panel discussion of the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. The Center for Geopolitics is an interdisciplinary space created by leading academics to consider within their historical context the world's most pressing current geopolitical questions. The center seeks to deepen the study of grand strategy and statecraft at the University of Cambridge, offer innovative opportunities for collaboration with practitioners, and deliver impactful engagement with the wider world. Thank you for joining today's session on Biden, U.S. foreign policy and China-Africa relations. Under former U.S. President Donald Trump, U.S. relations with several African countries appreciably soured and deteriorated, allowing for China to strategically increase its economic and political influence across Africa. The administration of recently elected U.S. President Joseph Biden now has a unique geopolitical window to constructively reshape U.S.-Africa relations so as to counter the expanding power of China in the African region. The Center for Geopolitics has brought together leading experts on African politics, Chinese engagement with Africa, and international affairs to explore the significance of the Biden administration's African foreign policy agenda and the effects Biden's agenda will have on existing Chinese influence in Africa. I am Christopher Wadibia, a PhD candidate at Selwyn College, Cambridge, and a research assistant at the Center for Geopolitics, and am joined today by Dr. Shirley Z. Yu, visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Asia Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and also the newly appointed Director of China-Africa Initiatives at the Feroz Lalji Center for Africa at the London School of Economics, Dr. Lina Ben Abdallah, Assistant Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University, and Dr. Barney Walsh, Lecturer in Security, Leadership, and Development Education at the African Leadership Center of King's College London. The structure of this event, which will last approximately 1 hour, will include opening statements from each of our panelists, followed by an opportunity for attendees to extend questions to our panelists by typing your questions into the Zoom question and answer section. We ask that attendees posing questions please include their name and institutional affiliation so that our panelists can direct their answers appropriately. We will now begin with an opening statement from Dr. Ben Abdallah. Dr. Ben Abdallah, thank you for joining us, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation. I'm delighted to be joining this distinguished panel of speakers to discuss this topic today. In my brief opening statement, I will talk about three main aspects, three main elements regarding U.S.-Africa relations, and by connection to that, China-Africa relations. The three elements I'm going to touch on are first, the ways in which the Biden administration can make a difference in U.S.-Africa policy. Second, the challenges facing the Biden administration. And third, the potential implications on China-Africa relations. And so I'll begin by saying that, quoting from a pre-recorded message that President Biden addressed to the African Union in February 2020. In the message, President Biden mentioned that he stated that the United States of America will be Africa's partner in solidarity, in support, and in mutual respect. And these are important elements in his speech, because when we think about U.S.-Africa relations, it presents a window of opportunity to speak about U.S.-Africa relations in this language of partnership and mutual support and mutual respect as well. And as we are assessing this window of opportunity, so the question becomes, what are the ways in which Biden administration can make a difference in turning around what we have seen in the last several years transpire out of U.S. foreign policy towards Africa. And so I'll begin here by giving just a few points about what is attractive in the U.S.-Africa relations and what can be a potential for U.S.-Africa relations based on these factors. So of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world in 2019, 6 were in Africa. World Bank's 2019 Doing Business Index lists 5 out of the 10 most improved countries being in Africa. In 2018, there were 442 active tech hubs in Africa, which represented 41% jump from a 2017 estimate of 314 tech hubs. Africa has more than 120 million active mobile money accounts, over 50% of the global total. Traditional banking products are no longer the only option in Africa. The trend is now allowing companies to improve productivity, speed up their transactions, and access wider markets, and could add $300 billion US dollars to the continent's GDP by 2025 alone. Over 400 African companies now boast annual revenues of $1 billion US dollars or more. 700 more companies report revenues of over 500 million US dollars. Africa's annual investment in infrastructure has doubled to around 80 billion US dollars a year since the beginning of the century. And with all of these stats in mind, I think focusing too much attention on countering China in Africa has over the last several years fragmented US policy in Africa. And I will here suggest that the best thing for US foreign policy towards Africa moving forward would be to put China aside and put countering China aside completely and focus on deepening mutual exchange, what Biden had said in the message, mutual support, really engaging Africans as partners. And the way to do that, I think, that engaging the U.S. private sector would be would open up the opportunity to do this, creating opportunities for entrepreneurship along the lines of what I had just mentioned in terms of interest in technology, tech hubs, and so on, startups and tech initiatives that can fulfill the need and obviously create opportunities for investment in these areas are very important. The second area that I think will be extremely important and a way for this administration to make a difference is enhancing exchange programs, cultural exchange programs, and education opportunities for Africans in the US. I think this should be a priority. Over the last several years, we have seen a number of visa bans and other immigration ban issues have had a really negative impact on making the US and US universities and higher education institutions be a destination for African elites and Africans in general. So over the last few years, the US has lagged behind in terms of participating in these cultural exchange programs and providing sponsorships for Africans to go to universities for degrees and other trainings. Now, my second point is about the challenges facing US foreign policy in Africa. Obviously, the biggest challenge is that there is, in my mind, an urgent need to move to action and to put to practice what the US promises to do in Africa and what several US initiatives have promised to do in theoretically. So there's a need to move to action and to make these concrete programs that will have concrete impacts. The COVID pandemic has proved to be an enormous challenge, as it was a missed opportunity in my mind for the US to show what Biden had said in the message I quoted about solidarity, support, and mutual respect. Acting in the pandemic would have actually been an opportunity to put in practice the solidarity, support, and mutual respect. Instead, what we have seen in terms of trends towards hogging vaccine supplies and driving the shortages for the better quality vaccines has really presented a challenge to the sincerity and wasted an opportunity. The third point, and I will close with here, the implications on China-Africa relations here, and the potential implications of a Biden administration policy towards Africa. Largely, I think that China's interests and engagement in Africa have rather been unfazed, have remained unfazed by the multiple threatening rhetoric that former US Secretary of State and other high-ranking government officials in the US have had. So these campaigns to paint China's engagement in the continent as negative and neo-colonial and the debt trap, the rhetoric and debt trap diplomacy as well come to mind, have largely passed without huge impacts. But that's not. But it wasn't without any exceptions. We saw, for example, the pressures that the U.S. government has put on Huawei has actually have had some impacts and effects in Africa, with several countries and governments in the African continent either sort of questioning or being reticent about their engagement and about their deals with Huawei because of these pressures. In many ways, I think if the US is going to take Biden's message to the African Union seriously and take Africans as partners, I think one extremely important step is to actually listen to African leaders and African peoples about what they think and their views and perceptions of China's role in the continent and other partners' role in the continent as well, and not engage in a sort of this, in a way, counterproductive, countering China, sort of a blanket policy of countering China in the continent. So I'll close here and I'll look forward to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for your insightful opening statement, Dr. Ben Abdallah. We will now hear from Dr. Walsh. Dr. Walsh, thank you for joining us, and we will now hear your opening statement.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to all. Thanks for having me here. For me, I see this situation as a leadership challenge. Okay, leadership is needed when things are not business as usual. There are not already the processes or procedures in place to manage or govern situations. Leadership's needed in times of crisis. Okay, Biden's dealing with a crisis. COVID pandemic, there is a global crisis going on. China-US relations are in crisis. Arguably, US relations globally post-Trump is in crisis, and US relations with Africa needs to change. Yes, exercising effective leadership is about inducing change into a situation. Similarly, to Prof. Ben Abdallah, if Biden is serious about this, he should not be looking to define his relationship, America's relationship with Africa, in terms of countering China. It should be defined and decided in terms of what Africa and Africans want and need, and where the US can potentially fit into that. For too long, the West and the US have pushed their own agenda onto Africa, both ideological and political. The history is Cold War cynical support for some brutal regimes. You have the structural adjustment programs pushing neoliberal free market agenda without empirical evidence to support the idea that that would lead to structural transformation in Africa. You have a pushing of a democratic and human rights discourse that is not always suitable to the context it's sometimes applied in the way it's applied. Post 9/11, you really saw the securitization of Africa and a militarized focus on Al-Shabaab in Somalia and Boko Haram in Nigeria, those kind of issues. And then in the COVID era, we don't know. It's unclear what the relationship's going to be in COVID and post-COVID world. The China relationship and history is different, and you can't wish away that history. Okay, the anti-colonial support to liberation movements that China gave is a key part of the relationship and the history. China doesn't meddle in security issues in the same way. China delivers tangible development projects, visible, high cost, high risk, potentially high reward projects. And in the COVID era, after a rocky start, racist incidents in both sides, is China now supplying the vaccines that Africa needs? Okay, let's see. There's a counter to that positive story, which we can discuss in the Q&A. Okay, but that's the narrative, and it's a strong narrative, actually. So we need to US need to reset, reconsider the relationship with Africa, because Africa needs China. It can't be about competition with them only. Okay, Africa needs the roads, it needs the rails, it needs the cheap mobile phones, it needs an alternative a great power partner, so at least it has choices of who to deal with. Okay, So it's about what can the US offer that is sincere. What are the short, medium, and importantly, long-term goals and strategies? Policy can't change every 4 years, okay? And that is going to potentially lead to transformation, socio-economic transformation in Africa. Neutrality is a key term within leadership studies. Where do the mutual interests and shared goals lie between the US and Africa and Africans, and who can offer solutions to those goals and help those be achieved? We've touched on them already, but some of them, but I also wanted some necessarily vague, but some kind of policy ideas or suggestions. The Obama 2014 summit that took place, really, that was a one-off event. I considered that quite a weak retaliation. It was a bit of a simplistic FOCAC copy and paste, but without so much money floating around. And it only happened once. Yes, it hasn't happened again. So I think there needs to be a definitive move away from this securitization and militarized agenda. It's simply not good enough. And the reality is Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, terrible though these kind of groups are, they are not the #1 security development challenge or threat that the vast majority of Africans face every day, okay? Education and jobs, scholarships can easily be increased. Visas, business visas, short-term visitors visas, as has already been said, can easily be made easier. Health, COVID vaccines are going to dominate geopolitics for the next 2 years and beyond. Booster jabs, whatever it is, what's the US role going to be in that? And post-pandemic, what's Africa going to need in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? What's the post-pandemic world going to look like? Technology has already been discussed. Okay, that's going to be a key part of Africa's post-COVID journey. Finance, debt relief will probably come up in the Q&A. Support for the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, extremely important. Diplomacy and engagement. What are the African voices that are around the table, wherever Biden's table is? Okay, I'm talking about state and non-state actors. What Africans are being listened to and views taken on board within the administration. And my final point, and the key one, governance issues are of course a big challenge and issue across Africa. I'm talking about Africa lazily here, yes. Of course, it's different countries, different regions and all of this, but for simplistic terms, it's an issue across Africa. What is the African model of transformative development going to be? It will not be and should not be the Western model or the Chinese model. It has to be and it will be the African model. And what's the role for the state, which is complex in Africa? What's it going to be in terms of development and transformative development? Because you seem to need a role for the state of some kind. So how can the US help engage and facilitate inclusive, legitimate political settlements in Africa that do not necessarily conform perfectly to the US or Western ideals of states and governance? That's a key challenge that the US has to decide upon. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh, for offering your thought-provoking opening statement. Dr. Yu, we now turn to you for your opening statement.
Hello, good day, everyone. I would like to address 3 key components of China's comprehensive engagement in Africa. One, I want to talk about the structural economic reasons for China's economic involvement in Africa. Africa, just like China 40 plus years ago, at the very beginning of its reform and opening up, process share very similar economic endowments that are conducive for early stage economic development. Virgin economies with a large, young, and unskilled labor force, long coastlines, huge land mass, ideal for global trade and export-led economic growth model, which was the beginner of China's modern economic takeoff. But today, China is losing those premiums that we just talked about. China is aging. China no longer has this labor premium. It's aging at a super speed today. By 2060, 1/3 of Chinese will be over the age of 65, making China one of the most aged countries in the world. And China's labor force decline will be an acute economic issue to address in the next stage of transformation process. And so this demographic time bomb is actually on the horizon. But culturally, by 2034, Africa's labor force is going to be bigger than China and India's combined. And by 2050, Africa is going to have 2.5 billion people and quite young still. And so this labor-intensive industry that China has been thriving on for the past 4 decades are actively seeking for those young, large, unskilled, and low-cost labor markets where it will recalibrate its production capacity too. Now, secondly, China is no longer low cost. China's per capita GDP hit $11,000 in 2020. So China is on the threshold of touching the high income country status. Sub-Saharan Africa's per capita GDP was a little less than $1,600 in 2019. Now, the middle to lower end of the global supply chains are going to inevitably move out of this China now today a very expensive lower to middle end the manufacturing market. And so China's lower to middle end, we're talking about from matchmaking to fabrics to machine parts. All these industries are going to absolutely move into the more emerging markets, possibly in ASEAN and increasingly in Africa. Now, the third reason China was a large agrarian economy for millennia, but now China is the world's largest food importer. So China's middle income class is ballooning from 400 million to 800 million in about a decade. And China's structural agricultural insufficiency is really a national security threat. And so China no longer has a more idle arable land due to this rapid urbanization process, but Africa's arable land is currently utilized only at a 25% level. So there are huge potential there. And with the rising China-Africa cross-border e-commerce trade that are particularly led by Africa's indigenous innovators and Alibaba, China will be Africa's largest agri-export market for a long time. And now China has put in its plan, in the 14th five-year plan, to turn China from the world's factory to the world's market, to essentially turn China into the world's biggest importer by 2025. And so what that means is that Chinese entrepreneurs realizes that Africa has a huge potential, but its supply is no longer able to satisfy China's enormous demand that are coming onto the horizon. And so the savvy entrepreneurs in China are investing on the supply side in the African market by bumping up the production capacity in order to supply China's enormous market demand. And lastly, Africa is increasingly turning itself into a consumer market. Africa has 380 million middle income class today. Urbanization rate is about 40%. Trading China, but not by far. So the rising middle class, they share very similar desires for smart city development, energy consumption, education, healthcare, finance. So all of those things, China, as the urbanization opportunities are getting saturated, this very rapid urbanization process has really honed Chinese entrepreneurial skills. And so these Chinese savvy companies are venturing into all these areas in Africa, building in Africa for Africa. And they are bringing not only the Chinese business development skills, but they are bringing IPs, technology platforms fit for the emerging market. So there are a lot of complementarities that we see in China and Africa today. But next, I want to talk about specifically China's digital transformation in Africa. So China is bringing to Africa this digital era experience before Africa has actually gone through the industrial era. So during the past 40 plus years, China has gone through very rapidly this second wave and third wave of industrial revolution, essentially in concurrence over the past 4 decades. And so foreign technology transfer really gave China and will give essentially all the late starters in global development this opportunity to bypass the normal development process. And so now China is at the global forefront of the 4th industrial revolution and essentially bringing that the digital experience to Africa today. But how does Africa develop its digital economy? Well, first of all, Africa needs the digital infrastructure. So China, under its signature Digital Silk Road initiative, is currently completing this 12,000 kilometers peace cable. And it's a submarine cable that connects from Pakistan to Djibouti, to Kenya, and then all the way down Africa's east coast to South Africa. And so this submarine cable is built by Huawei. Now, they will offer the world's fastest cable networks with low-cost transmission, essentially leveling off Africa's digital infrastructure in unprecedented ways to the level of its Eurasian counterparts, because the second leg of China's peace cable essentially transmits across the Mediterranean to southern France. And on the west coast of Africa, there were traditional submarine cables, but Huawei has won the bid and upgraded the west coast submarine cables as well. So now you're looking at along Africa's 2 coasts, the fastest speed underwater transmission are essentially built with Chinese telecom infrastructure expertise. And now half of Africa's smartphones are made in China. And essentially out of every 10 smartphones used by Africans, 4 are produced by one single Chinese company, Transsion. And next, with the digital infrastructure, Africa's e-commerce platform started to take off. And on the basis of that e-commerce, digital payments and the fintech begin to rise. Alibaba launched this electronic world trade platform, EWTP. That's essentially a WTO, think about it as a WTO for the e-commerce world. And so it's designed to foster this world digital economy for one world in trade. And so it's working actively with African partners and governments in initiating the digital economy exercise, the integration of e-commerce, digital payments, logistics management, and the digital entrepreneurship training all onto this platform. And thirdly, the efficiency of the e-commerce really requires very robust logistics infrastructures. Now, Africa, the experience is that 50 to 75% of the current retail sales in Africa, it's attributable to logistics. And smart logistics on the basis of this telecom infrastructure and the rise of the e-commerce model, now it's currently being developed in Africa. And we are looking at a very similar model to China's vibrant SimCity delivery services. And now we see in Kenya and other countries the ride-hailing model for deliveries that are being done on tricycles, motorcycles, etc. And also drones are being used in Africa for deliveries from goods to blood, emergency blood. And so drone manufacturer from China, DJI, alone takes up 70% of the global commercial drones manufacturing. So the digital logistics are playing a huge part in Africa's digital economy. And so China really enables and transforms Africa's digital aspirations, essentially to provide Africa with the ultimate economic leveling off experience in the 21st century. But now let me talk about what China has that Africa actually does not have. And Africa today really needs to be mindful of in terms of its development experience. Now, firstly, China stepped into the digital era, essentially in the early 2000s. But by then, China had already become the world's factory with a very robust position within the global industrial supply chain and getting stronger since then. And so, but that was a sequential development. So China's digital economy essentially rose on the basis of a very strong industrial capacity. Africa does not really have the global industrial supply chain that China has. So it really needs to be mindful that when it develops this very robust and vibrant digital economy model, which is essentially based on the service-based economy, Africa really needs to the governments really needs to support the rise of the industries. So with that, a very strong industry supported modern economy, the economy will become hollow. Essentially, you will have the first industry and the tertiary industry. So the digital economy will be confined only to selling very primitive and low value added goods. That's not good for economic sustainability. So Africa really needs to compete with the digital economy to pull them back and essentially build up this very strong industrial base. Secondly, Africa is not a single market. The intracontinental trade barriers are enormous. And so in a continent where many languages are spoken, many nations impose tariff and non-tariff barriers to each other, the cost of trade is very high. And this Africa Free Trade Agreement plans to remove 90% of the bilateral tariffs, which essentially is forecast to increase Africa's intracontinental trade just within Africa itself by 52%, rising by half. So this is going to be significant to build Africa into a single market. And thirdly, this is a question I have been thinking a lot about, is Africa's entrepreneurship is rising on the back of this robust digital infrastructure available today. So when when Alibaba or Tencent in China rose at the beginning, China has used the protective policies to protect its internet market from Western competition for quite a long time. And essentially, I would say, for decades and still ongoing. So let's imagine if Amazon and Alibaba were to move into Africa today, the indigenous innovation and the entrepreneurs will be absolutely unable to compete. So I think Africa really needs to protect its indigenous innovation, protect this market for a period of time till the African indigenous innovators become competitive within its market. And again, I'm not here advocating protectionist policies, but the consequences of not protecting this market. And so these are some big questions for African leadership to consider.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Yu, for those outstanding remarks. We will now take questions from the audience. If you would like to submit a question, please do make use of the Zoom Q&A function, and please ensure to include your name and institutional affiliation. In the meantime, I would like to offer a question to Dr. Yu. Who would you argue benefits the most from China's investments in African development? Would these be the elites, the middle classes, the poor, or China itself?
That's a great question. I think, China today, there is a misunderstanding. There's been a lot of talk about the paternalistic behaviors in Africa, China's resources grabbing, in Africa. And so around these sentiments, I think data does speak a lot. So today, 70% of the total investment, foreign direct investment in Africa are done by Chinese private companies, and 90% of the Chinese players in Africa are private companies. And so what do they invest in? They invest in all the urbanization opportunities, digital opportunities. They are investing in health, entertainment. Somebody just told me Chinese entrepreneurs are building huge entertainment centers. They're investing in movies. So all of these things will benefit the middle class. But on the other hand, we're talking about the state sector from China, essentially that are quintessentially investing in metals, resources, in energy. So China, 1/3 of Africa's energy infrastructure, particularly electricity infrastructure, are done by Chinese companies. And so all of those things, the public good, as our previous speakers talked about, they need heavy investments and they are long-term return in nature. And so I think by China stepping in to build up those digital infrastructure, it'll create a long-term sustainable effect for the society's development as a whole. So I think those are good investments for the future. And so it's really different sort of investments benefit different socioeconomic sectors. But overall, I think the fundamental question is there is complementarity. So by Africa's economic rising, China takes the benefit as well. Just like 40 years ago when US and European counterparts came into China, who are the biggest beneficiary? China was, but so were the Western multinationals.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Yu. Thank you. We now have a question from the audience, and I think I will direct this question at Dr. Walsh. Derek Laud of King's College states, members of the panel all share one central common theme. They see the Biden shift towards more cooperation between the US and the African Union as a foreign affairs issue. However, how much of the Biden policy shift is influenced by internal US politics? Dr. Walsh, would you happen to have an opinion on this?
Thanks. Look, I mentioned about kind of long-term planning and not having policies change every 4 years if the president changes, etc. Of course, that is very difficult. Yes, the US system is not the same as China, and it's hard to. I mean, China really, Chinese culture as well thinks decades, centuries, even, really. Okay, in a way that the West does not and cannot. So of course, domestic politics is going to play a role in this. I do think, it's difficult. Leadership is difficult, and things like, the kind of anti-terrorist sentiment, for example, in much of America, of course, that's going to play out in terms of the US having to react to Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, etc. But it takes, a more strategic mind. It takes people being able to explain the importance of other security development challenges in Africa and its relevance to America. I do think I wanted to make a point as well. One, I haven't got a concrete idea on this, but I do feel the other professor mentioned, cultural exchanges and things like that. There's something I'm sure in the the kind of history of the American diaspora and the African American community in the US that could somehow be tapped into, for want of a better word, and you could do interesting cultural exchanges, education programs, and that kind of thing to get a kind of Pan-African, global Pan-African agenda of some kind to that. But you have to try and explain to the US populace why Africa matters to America, and not just in a cynical, because Al-Shabaab is there and the Chinese are taking it over. It has to be more thoughtful than that. I hope that it's not an easy question.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Walsh. We now have a question for Dr. Ben Abdallah from Edgar Barroso from Mozambique. Apart from military cooperation, fighting terrorism, and humanitarian aid, what does the US have to offer Africa?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question. It is also a tough question, as I perhaps don't necessarily like to see this as what the US has to offer Africa. I think it's, in a way, I think a huge problem, in my view, in my reading of US-Africa relations and how it differs from China-Africa relations, is precisely this view of offering and a view of charity and a view of sort of conducting relations in a hierarchical way. I think opportunities for investments make more sense than opportunities for foreign aid, or for opportunities for humanitarian aid, or for, much worse would be sort of interventionism in a way, right? So I think that key to potential improvement and enhancement of the relations between the US and Africa would be to shift the mindset completely from a mindset of giving and a mindset of foreign aid and charity and hierarchical relations in this way to a mindset of investment. What are the opportunities? What is this sort of, and I talked a bit about this in my opening statements. I gave all kinds of statistics about the burgeoning area of tech innovations, for example, entrepreneurships, the thirst for infrastructure, for startups, for all kinds of different initiatives that I think once again private sector in the US can be involved in, and not in a foreign aid given perspective, but more of an investment perspective. And so, I mean, I think to me that's the key, is to engage with the needs and wants and dreams and aspirations of African youths. What are Africans dreaming of? What do they want to do? What are they aspiring to? What are the needs in the continent? And so, yeah, I think moving away precisely from this military kind of heavy engagement and interference and interventionism and humanitarian aid is crucial to moving forward and unstucking basically U.S.-Africa relations in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ben Abdallah. We now have a question for Dr. Yu from Jing Lao, a postgraduate student at King's College London. China would like to transfer the former resource-seeking relations to the new South-South cooperation form of engagement. Could you please clarify what you mean by this transformation?
I didn't refer to specifically the South cooperation, but I think what the audience is referring to is China's Belt and Road Initiative. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the genesis of this China's Belt and Road Initiative, in which Africa is a quintessential part of it. And so in 2013, when it started with a very intuitive economic incentive, which was in 2013, well, after the global financial crisis, China put a lot of monetary liquidity into the system that created a lot of excess capacity. And then China didn't know what to do with it. And China thought, okay, so we're going to export this extra steels, glass, whatever, to the more emerging economies around us. And so that'll solve our excess capacity problem. So that was a very benign incentive. But then it's really transformed both in its scale and its understanding. And so China's Belt and Road Initiative has comprehensively now moved into this digital transformation across this broader, we're looking at a broader Eurasian region and essentially touching Latin America, Africa, and essentially, other than North American region, the Belt and Road Initiative encompasses all major geographical regions and economies in the world. And so this digital transformation is going to be underpinned by fundamentally two leading technologies that China today has the capacity for. One is the telecom infrastructure, and China is aiming to build not only the telecom infrastructure network, but also the telecom infrastructure standards across this large developing world. And secondly, China's fintech capabilities, essentially now with the imminent sovereign digital currencies launch. And when it moves across border, it's essentially going to, the digital form of this monetary multilateral framework within the Belt and Road Initiative is going to facilitate trade, investment in the Chinese RMB, and essentially to propel the internationalization of the RMB in all these spectrums, including in respective countries' reserve status. And so China's digital push within the Belt and Road Initiative with its leading infrastructures in the digital realm is what I was referring to, that are comprehensively transforming the parts of the world that have been essentially left behind because of the late coming status in catching up with the global waves of technological revolutions ever since 1750, since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. So now, what is fundamental in global development is the early starters of cutting-edge global technology, the early adopters of cutting-edge global technology will have an economic takeoff effect against the rest. And think about the 21st century, somebody was referring to that Havana in Cuba is going to have 5G before Miami. And so you're looking at Ethiopia possibly having 5G before London. So what does that really mean for the transformation of Africa? It's profound.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. Thank you. Another question for Dr. Ben Abdallah from Mark Karuku, a student at the University of San Francisco. It seems like China is focused more on logistics in its engagement with Africa, while the US has a heavily militarized focus on the continent. So what would spark a conversation shift on the US side to focus more on its logistical connections?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think when we try to understand why, the reason behind this sort of heavy military and militarized focus of US presence in Africa, I mean, we put this in the context and understand it's all the sort of in the post, 9/11 atmosphere, and how in a way, much of US foreign policy all over the world was shaped very much by the sense of national security, the sense that if it's justifiable as a national security threat or as a counter for a potential threat to national security, then it's a go. And unfortunately, that has painted and colored much of US foreign policy in Africa, that it has had to be about US foreign policy and the interests of national security. But the downside of that is that it left out potentials and possibilities for developing and relations and ties to Africans themselves, and connecting to Africans for the sake of connections and connecting to Africans, not for the sake of national security priority. Now, a couple of years ago, that national security priority have shifted in the US from a post 9/11 sort of counterterrorism to countering China. And so when that shifted, we saw that the US foreign policy towards Africa shifted in that format, meaning wherever China's interests are in Africa, that presents a national security threat to the US, and that needs to be countered. What remains similar across these two trends, both a 9/11 atmosphere and countering China, is that Africans themselves are just a sort of a background for what is perceived to be US national security. And that is a missed opportunity, because the US is not developing enough, ties and connections in the African continent for the sake of that. And I think what's going to spark this change, hopefully, is both a clear sense that we've seen a lot of African leaders, a lot of African think tanks, Africa-based institutions calling on US administration to take and seize the opportunity now to change things around, to say, instead of focusing on only sort of seeing the continent from the prism of this sort of post 9/11 world order, that there is a lot more that can be done. And so hopefully what we might see is a push both from the African side and as well a receptivity from the Biden administration to think about the African continent as a place that serves more than fulfilling what US national security priorities are for the day, whether it's countering terrorism or countering China or countering Russia or countering X or Y. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Ben Abdallah. We now have a question for Dr. Walsh. This question is from John Mark, a student at the Fletcher School. John Mark asks, what are the sentiments of Africans in Africa regarding how China and its citizens conduct themselves in Africa with regards to human rights abuses and predatory financing? And also, as a follow-up to that, John Mark asks, how about this notion of corruption that exists among some African leaders, which helps foster the continent's relationship with China?
Thanks. Yeah, okay. Let me apologize for trying to speak on behalf of Africans in Africa, because I'm not African and I'm in the UK, of course. But generally there's a tension. There have been issues between local Africans and local Chinese. There's lots of non-tensions, and you can go to any African country, and I really mean any African country, certainly that I've been to in the last 5-10 years, and you can see the Chinese. Yes, you can see the Chinese in a way that you didn't 20 years ago. Okay, but there is a general perception that yes, not human rights issues, yes, but more in kind of employment. Yeah, there's kind of a perception or an idea that Chinese bosses don't treat African workers as well. There's tension in certain countries between local market traders. Yeah, so if you're an African local market traders, and lots of the Chinese migrants who come are selling similar goods to local Africans, you know, fabrics or, you know, shoes, mobile phones, or whatever it is. So there's certain places that there have been tensions around that. So it is an issue. It was an issue early on in COVID. There was some footage in Kenya and I think some other places, you know, of Chinese. This was, you know, when it was still in Wuhan, and you know, of Chinese being kicked out of places actually, and you know, that kind of thing. So there was bubbling tension there, certainly. On the corruption thing, look, it's certainly a thing. It's a feature of the relationship. I always talk about corruption in inverted commas, because what counts in corruption in Africa, and why is, you know, businesses lobbying the UK government not count as corruption or whatever it is. But I think we've all got a general idea of corruption. It is an issue. If you think big billion-dollar Chinese deals with Africans aren't involving some kind of backhanders and nefarious activities, you know, that's poor analysis. That is happening, I have no doubt, and I mean, and it is happening. Corruption, it's important not to, in my opinion, corruption is a symptom of governance issues in Africa. It's not necessarily, you know, the cause of governance issues. China is an interesting example, sorry to go on, of actually historically has been a very corrupt country that has undergone amazing economic transformation. Okay, so kind of corruption is not an automatic barrier to economic transformation. Okay, it's happened in China. I'm not saying corruption is a good thing, it hinders development, but it's, you can't just kind of stop corruption and everything will be okay. Or you have to take a holistic solution to governance, processes, and economic development, etc., etc. But it's a problem. It is a problem. You can't wish it away within the relationship. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. We now have a question for Dr. Ben Abdallah before we come back to Dr. Yu. Kenneth Ameshi from the University of Edinburgh asks, do you think African leaders are aware of many of the issues raised so far? If so, what do you think they are doing about them? Otherwise, why?
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to have to take the liberty of interpreting what the issues are, the issues raised so far. But you know, if this means issues in terms of what competition between US and China means and how that plays out in the continent, I think we definitely have seen them react to this. We've seen a lot of African leaders, President of Rwanda, of South Africa, of Uganda, several others have clearly stated that they have no interest in picking sides and choosing between the US and China, that they believe that it's counterproductive to put the African continent in a sort of Cold War looking or seeming scenario that they have to choose a side. We have seen them, for example, what are they doing about this in particular, besides calling on leaders in China and in the US to sort of stop putting Africa in the middle of that competition, is to engage the two powers, you know, on competitive grounds. For example, you take Djibouti. It is one of the very few countries where China and the US cohabitate. They have to cohabitate. They have to work alongside each other, whether they like it or not. Both China and the US have strategic bases in Djibouti, and they are a few miles, you know, apart from each other, and they absolutely have to be there, you know, at the same time and in the same place. And Djibouti does not shy away from dealing with the two countries and from bargaining for the better deal for the citizens of Djibouti. And so it kind of drew up the price in trying to bargain, and put the two offers on the table and try to get a better bargain for the country itself. So we have seen African governments and African leaders do something about this in this matter. But we're also seeing a very, very encouraging trend in Africa these days, and I'm very happy to basically say that we've seen a trend of increasing think tank and centers of knowledge production and analysis in the continent coming up. There's a center now, several centers that take on the study of China Africa, take on the study of US Africa, take on the study of Chinese studies or US studies in the continent. And I think this is going to play a big difference and play a big role in shaping the future of policy and policy making world in Africa towards both the US and China. So we're having homegrown analyses and knowledge apologies. I was getting too passionate talking about this, but to temper it down, there's a great trend of knowledge production opportunities coming out of the continent to address these issues. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Ben Abdallah, for your expertise and your passion. Thank you. We now turn to Dr. Yu for perhaps the last question, or maybe we can fit another one in. But Na Komi Mensa from Kenya asks, how are the US and China positioned to support Africa in realizing the full potential of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? Is it in their interest that this is successful?
China has been instrumental in supporting the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreements. And to China, to turn Africa into because in looking at, again, China's economic experience, when China got started in the early 1980s, there was a little village in the south of China next to Shenzhen. It was a fisherman's village. And then Chinese leadership circled it. And 40 years later, its GDP is bigger than Hong Kong. And one of the world's most vibrant innovation centers called Shenzhen. And so this special economic zone model was a unique Chinese economic development experience, which China is transferring into Africa. And so the special economic zones, and China wants the big market. And essentially what large economies, when they want to invest in emerging markets, they look for standardized rule of law. They look for scalability of the market, and all of which, if Africa is divided into 55 countries, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work for foreign companies to invest and learning 55 set of rules at the same time. And so it's a mutual strategic and commercial objectives. I think China is heavily in support of that. But I wanted to come back to the corruption question. So when China lends to African countries, China does not impose these conditionalities to its loan, namely environmental standards or corruptions, which the U.S. loans, from the World Bank, etc., they often put in these conditions. And so what that means is that it's actually the China's model of lending is actually offering African countries today an alternative, and the plausible alternative for African countries to choose, do I really want these conditions or do I not? So China uniquely sees corruption as an internal issue, just like what was mentioned, China has it of itself. And so China does not, from China's perspective, it is internal. China is not going all over the countries and telling them, you gotta build clean governments in order for me to lend to you. I don't think that's likely to happen. And so then it becomes essentially a domestic issue for African countries or the other countries to resolve, really.
Excellent. And Dr. Yu, a quick follow-up question, and this will be the last question of this event, from Jing Lao at King's College London. How do you respond to the argument that China, that asserts that China is trying to colonize Africa? How would you respond to that assertion?
That's not going to happen. China couldn't care less, to be honest. China has a very mercantilist way of thinking. If you look even post the COVID-19, China China did join the G20 in providing this debt relief, because China is I believe 30% debt holders in Africa today, a large a creditor. And so China did the G20 portion, and on top of that, China did relieve further the zero interest rate loans that were maturing by the end of 2020. And so China has, but even with all of these efforts, China said officially that we want a win-win situation, and we want a bilateral engagement with African countries in resolving the debt issue. Well, to me, in times of crisis, for China to become a global leader, China cannot always think about win-win. China needs to start thinking about lose-win, because that's what leaders do. You lose in order for the rest of the world to win. And so there are sacrifices involved, but you could see the mentality today. China is still looking for this very mercantilist way of relationships that drives a win-win solutions. And so with that said, China needs resources, I just mentioned. China needs agriculture. And now with the US-China geopolitical conflict, and so China is diverting a lot of the agricultural imports in Latin America and Africa. And with China, Australia, having this freezing trade relationship, China is developing iron ore mines in Africa. And so all of these are based on very intuitive trade dynamics. But China would have no intention to, that's very 19th century thinking. I don't think there is any, this is not occupying anybody's mind in Beijing at the moment. Certainly, that's not a likely scenario.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you to everyone for attending tonight's event, Biden, U.S. Foreign Policy and China-Africa Relations, and to our distinguished panelists for their outstanding contributions. You can find the Center for Geopolitics on Twitter at @CamGeopolitics, and all of our events are advertised on our website at www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk. Again, thank you, everyone, and take wonderful care. All the best.